I'm going to guess all of us would agree that friendship, relationships are an area of struggle today, that in some ways we don't place the value on relationships the way that other cultures do, or maybe that we did in the past. When we think of love, for example, love this person, well, right away we just immediately go to romantic love, the relationship between a man and a woman, husband and wife. We think of marriage as romance. Robert Johnson wrote this. He said, Sanskrit has 96 words for love. Ancient Persian has 80. Greek has 3. Some argue 4, 3 or 4. And English, only 1. This is prime evidence that feelings and relationships are the inferior functions of our society. And he goes on to talk about societies have, primary functions and then inferior functions. And here's one example. He says Eskimos have 30 different words for snow because it's a life and death matter for them to have exact information about the element they live with so intimately. Lack of language for any subject means lack of interest in that area. We build wonderful 747 jet planes and atomic jet generators, but we build very poor relationships. I don't know, do you agree with that? Might seem a little harsh, but it's pretty obvious at least that our language for love is kind of limited. But his other point too about how there's a low value placed on relationships in general, he's not alone in saying that. Social commentator John L. Locke, just a couple years ago, put it this way. He said there are now fewer intimate social relationships than at any other time in modern history. Intimate does not mean romantic or sexual. Like, intimate is close connections, right? There are now fewer intimate social relationships than at any other time in modern history. As a consequence, unfamiliarity, suspiciousness, distrust, and loneliness are on the rise. And I've shared this quote before, but this one is so powerful. George Gallup, before he died, said that Americans today are among the loneliest people who have ever lived. You might have seen this book. Two sociologists, you can see their names, Pamela Prickett and Stefan Timmermans, looked at this problem that there are so many people today that have nobody, that when they die, they don't know what to do with the body because there's no one to claim the body. And so they do this study of what happens in the city of LA for a certain period of time and all the people. So let's just do I'm curious about the numbers, if we could guess. How many people, when they die in the United States, do you think go unclaimed? What would be a number? What would you say? How many people a year? 10,000? Any other guesses? 150,000. 150,000 a year. And again, just one other sort of data point about the estrangement that so many people are living with. And so in this world, the Christian faith comes and brings with it a very strong emphasis on relationship, friendship. Friendships are at the heart of Christianity, if you think about it. Not only friendship with God as opposed to estrangement, but also friendship with other people, relationships with other people. In the early church, we see this demonstrated in the book of Acts, for example. These early Christians were not just fellow worshipers, they were friends. They shared life together, not just church. They shared their lives together. They hung out together. They spent time in each other's homes. And one of the significant ways that God brings blessings into our lives, in fact, maybe you could say the most significant way, the primary way that God brings blessings, guidance, encouragement, strength, all these things that God brings into our lives, God brings those things through people, through the relationships that we have with fellow believers. And one of the great tragedies then of the church today is that there are so many people who even their church experience, they exist on the outskirts of church and never really get the benefits and the help, the encouragement that comes through people. Well, in the passage we just looked at there, Philippians 2, verses 19 through 30, we get some insights about the friendship that Paul had with these two guys, Timothy and Epaphroditus. And these verses teach us a little bit, give us some insights about how friendships develop, the glue that holds them together. I'm not saying that what we're going to share here today is sort of like the be-all and end-all of how to build relationships. This is not a relationship seminar, but the point is, when we look at these verses, we're going to get some important reminders about how relationships, what's important in Christian friendships. And so we're going to, the outline here, we're calling these 4 marks, 4 qualities or characteristics of genuine Christian relationship, Christian friendship. All right, so the first one, we see this right off the bat, is genuine concern, genuine care for the other person. In contrast to what is often a kind of self-centered mindset, selfishness in the way that we live our lives. In verses 19 and 20, you see how Paul talks about Timothy. In fact, really this whole section, Timothy is a really important person in Paul's life, or was, throughout his life. Timothy came to faith through Paul's ministry. They worked closely together. They became friends. Timothy traveled with Paul on a number of the missionary journeys that Paul took. They'd been in prison together. And here Paul pays Timothy a great compliment. In verse 20, if you have the Bible there, just look. In verse 20, he says, "I have no one else like him who takes a genuine interest in your welfare." In other words, when Paul looks around him, as is the case probably if we look around us, we see a lot of self-interest, people who are just absorbed in their own stuff. But in fact, he talks about that in verse 21. Everyone is just interested in their own welfare. They're just looking out for number one, but not Timothy. Some time ago, a telephone company in New York, as a New York-based company, they wanted to find out how people used their telephone. And this is crazy. I'm sure this was illegal, but they kept records of phone conversations and studied them. And to find out what people talk about on their phone. And you know what people talk about on their phones? Themselves. The personal pronoun I was the most commonly used word. I guess that just makes sense. But in 500 phone conversations that they analyzed, I was used an average of 8 times in every conversation. We just want to talk about ourselves. William Gladstone put it this way: selfishness is the greatest curse of the human race. And Paul makes mention of the fact that Timothy is not like that. He's really concerned for the welfare of other people, the welfare of people in that church. Now, that's also true of the other person that's talked about here, Epaphroditus, this other friend Paul mentions. He had come from the church in Philippi. He'd come from that church to help Paul. And when in doing this, he got very sick. In fact, he almost died. And in that situation, his big concern was not for himself. Verse 26, if you look at that, it says he was distressed. Why was he distressed? He was concerned that the other people, that the church in Philippi, that those people would be overly worried about him. That's what he was concerned about. One of the great marks of Christian friendship is that it arises out of this love and concern for other people. People who are only interested in themselves don't make very good friends. In fact, people who want friends just so that they can have friends seldom make good friends. I'm sure you've heard this quote. I think this is worth looking at again and again, especially young people, as you think about how you build things in your life. Keep this one in mind. It's an oldie but a goodie from the man himself, Dale Carnegie. Remember Dale Carnegie? He had that friend, or that popular book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Well, here's what he said. You can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. There's something about that when we have genuine care and interest in other people, when we focus on that, the relationships just tend to flower and grow. Genuine love and concern. Okay, that's the first mark. The second mark of Christian friendship, the second reason that Paul has these close relationships with Timothy and Epaphroditus, has to do with their common commitment to Christ. They cared about each other, they cared about other people, but they cared about this mission that they were a part of. They cared about the interests of the gospel of Christ. See this in verse 21. Paul says, everyone looks out for his own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. Again, in contrast to Timothy and Epaphroditus, the second mark of Christian friendships is that we have this common spiritual commitment, this common faith. It's not only common beliefs that we share, but it's also like a deep commitment to those beliefs, a commitment to Jesus and to the work of the gospel. This is based on the general principle that it applies in any and all relationships, that friendships are made by people who have common interests, who have common commitments, who do things together. You might remember or might be familiar with this book. C.S. Lewis wrote a book about the four Greek words for love. One of those is phileo, which is often translated friendship, or it's about the familial kind of love, people that you make friendships with, you want to hang out with. Anyway, here's what he says about that. We picture lovers face to face, but friends side by side. Their eyes look ahead. That is why those people who simply want friends can never have any. The very condition of having friends is that we should want something else besides friends. Friendship must be about something, even if it were only an enthusiasm for dominoes or white mice. In our case, a common commitment about something that matters, right? Our faith in Christ and the work of Christ in the world. Friendship arises from those common interests. And Christian friendship goes a little deeper than, sharing interests in hunting or golfing or whatever. We share a common interest in our Christian faith, a common commitment, and that brings a bond that is deeper than just, again, people that you play cards with or hang out with, playing whatever. There's a different dimension, there's a closeness that emerges, which the Bible calls fellowship. That emerges, it's like deeper relationships emerge out of that deeper commitment. And, we've seen this over and over. A woman wrote this letter to her pastor. She had come to faith later in her life, And she said, the friendships that I've made since I became a Christian 18 months ago, the friendships I've made in these 18 months have been far closer and deeper than those I have with people that I've known for years, for like 30 years. So in fact, sometimes we have a hard time even finding the language for this, that to describe this common bond that we have with fellow Christians. We use language of brother and sister. They're like not just a guy I hang out with, but he's like my brother. You know, not just a woman that we share things with, but my sister. So it's this deep commitment. And again, that's how Paul refers to these guys, as brothers. All right. So common concern, common commitment. The third mark, the third thing that Christian friendships arise out of, it's kind of related to what we've been saying, but I want to push it a little bit further, and that is a common cause, a common vision, a common goal. So Paul and Timothy and Epaphroditus, they served together in the work of the gospel. That's verse 22. In fact, the word there literally means co-servant, or even it's sometimes in other places translated fellow slave, like co-slaves. We were in this together, Paul and Timothy. And then later, verse 25, he uses similar language. He's talking about this other guy, Epaphroditus. He's a fellow worker. So it's very often in our working together, in our serving together, that's what brings us close with other Christians. So it's important to just meet with other Christians, to be together, to talk and pray together. We have fellowship after church, we talk and we visit. But if that is all it ever is, there's something that's missing. There's a depth that's missing, because unless we're involved together in the work of the gospel, when we're working together towards the same purpose and not just hanging out and talking about the weather or talking about even spiritual things, friendships take off in a new way. In fact, this is a common experience of Christians who get involved in service projects and ministries together, that the friendship just takes off. And it's different than, just if you say, I want to have some Christian friends. It's like you get involved and then things happen. So sometimes people will say, look, I'm not sure, kind of on the outside of the church. I'm trying to see if I can make good friends here in the church, and if so, then I'll get involved. No, it doesn't work that way. It's actually the opposite. You get involved, and then the friendships emerge out of that. So shared challenges is the fourth one. All right. So we've talked about these common cause and commitment, but you get involved in this common cause, and there's going to be challenges then. And so this is the fourth factor that emerges out of Christian friendships. Paul describes Epaphroditus. Do you notice these words? Verse 25. He's my brother, my fellow worker, and fellow soldier. Several other places in the New Testament, Paul uses this language. He refers to other people as soldiers, fellow soldiers or soldiers for Christ. Now, I get that some people might feel uncomfortable with that kind of language because it suggests violence or aggression, but there's a lot of dimensions to this analogy that are like really super helpful. The Christian life, it's not all fun and games, right? You're devoting yourself to something that has risk and challenge to it. And it's a little weird for us to identify with this today, for us to kind of get this today, because it's so easy, or at least it has been. I think it's getting harder, but it has been for so long to just be easy to be a Christian. We don't go to prison. We don't face persecution. We're not going to be, killed for our faith. but we do face other kinds of opposition. We do things in our commitment to sort of give ourselves fully to this mission in the world. The Christian faith does call us to step out and to take risks. It calls us to do things that are hard, to sacrifice our time. We just got through we got through this week called BACK, our art camp. Some of you worked really, really hard. Gave a lot of yourself to that. That's one example. We're called to give generously. That's not something that is easy for a lot of us. Soldiers do what they've got to do. They'll do whatever they need to do to win, because it's a life and death struggle. They'll put up with discomfort. They'll put up with danger. They'll put up with lack of sleep. They'll put up with suffering, because they know the stakes are so high. So Christian friendship involves supporting each other through tough times and being together through the battles that we will inevitably face in life, in the spiritual life. So Epaphroditus might be someone you might not know a lot about. Paul says that he's willing to risk his life for the sake of his friend Paul. There's an interesting background. So Epaphroditus, his parents named him after the Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite. So that's where that term comes from. So the Greek goddess of love was Aphrodite. He was probably dedicated to Aphrodite when he was a child. But there's another connection, and that word is also a gambling term. So was the patron saint of gambling. And in fact, the Greek writer Plutarch says that when they would cast dice in gambling, the highest score that they could get was called Epaphroditus. And so his name might have kind of literally meant like someone blessed with gambling luck. Okay? So Epaphroditus took on that character trait and then applied it to his service to God. And in fact, look at verse 30. There's actually a play on words that we probably don't get, or we certainly don't get in English. Once you know this about him, it says that he risked his life. It's actually, he gambled his life. This gambler, the gambling connection, he gambled. He risked it all, put himself at risk for being arrested, put himself at risk health-wise, put himself at risk with just the challenges of making it through life because he was devoting himself to this service. So he was willing to do this. Now, thinking about this stuff this week just made me reflect on that question. What am I willing to risk? Again, as a Christian in the West, it's so easy. Some years ago, some of you know I do teaching for YWAM, Youth with a Mission, and I met this young woman in one of the classes I was teaching. She's from China, and she told a story about the church. She was worshiping in a church in China. It was like on a high level of a house, or they have these multi-story apartments, way high, and they were on their house church was in this on a high story. And she said one time we sang too loud, and the people below us figured out what was going on, and so they reported us, and the pastor and a bunch of people got arrested. It's like that's how some people live, and some people deal with their Christian faith with the threat of that kind of stuff hanging over them. And here we are, here in this country, we have freedoms to do all kinds of stuff. We don't face legal opposition. Maybe it's a hassle to come here on a Sunday morning, but on the other hand, it's air conditioned. We give you some good food. What does it mean for us? What do we risk to serve, to be a part of the mission of God's work in the world? So I'm going to tell you a story, and it's actually embarrassing when I think about it, but I'll tell you it anyway. Some years ago at a different church, we had printed up invite cards for our Easter service. And this was actually in Texas. And because it was in Texas, we could play tennis even in the wintertime. So I was on a tennis team. So it's like, I don't know, March, I guess. And there was a guy on the team named Joe. And here's what you got to know about Joe. Joe was this big dude. He's probably about as tall as me, but jacked. He was an amateur bodybuilder. So if you think of like Arnold Schwarzenegger with a 1970s weird mustache, that was Joe. And he was a super funny guy, super outgoing, very open about partying. He was always going to different things, partying, drinking. And we developed somewhat of a friendship. We were doubles partners in some of our matches. And one night after practice, I thought I should invite Joe to our church service. And so the practice is over, and I go to my car and I see there's a invite card. And Joe is still in the parking lot talking to somebody else, and I'm like, I should give it to Joe. And so I pick up the card, and then all kinds of thoughts flood my mind. No, he's going to think you're weird. He's going to think you joined this league just to recruit people to your church. He's not going to like it. It's going to make the rest of your season weird. All these things. So then I go back, I put it down, and then I pick it up again. Literally, I picked it up, got out of the car, went back and forth a couple of times, and I eventually did give it to Joe. But like all those spinning in my mind, just this one little thing, how challenging it is to take a risk. And we are going to have this. We're going to have this in a variety of ways. Now, he was not offended, just so you know. The story, I sometimes tell these stories and then people will ask me, what happened? Where did it go? So he did not come to the church, but we maintained a good relationship after. But it's like all these things, even just the little risk of disapproval from somebody freaks us out. Well, I would say that there are times, and there's going to be some times for every one of us. The particular issue might be different, but there's going to be times for every one of us that we are called on to risk something in the process of growing spiritually, in the process of being a part of God's work in the world. And then we're going to have some decisions to make, right? What are we going to do? So in the days of the early church, there was an association of people that were called the gamblers. And you know why they were called the gamblers? Because they would go to prisons and they would go visit sick people and present the gospel to them. And I think we have a little bit of an understanding of what that means now in the post-pandemic phase. Remember in the early days of the pandemic, everybody's freaking out about the potential of getting the disease. And then imagine like no masks, no technology. There's this thing that's killing people. You're going to go visit them. That's what these people, that's why they were called the gamblers. They would go visit people and risk their own lives to do it. And I never realized how significant this was until I came across this book a few years ago called The Rise of Christianity. And it's Rodney Stark he's a sociologist. I think he's a Christian, but he wrote the book as a sociologist trying to answer the question, how did the early church explode in growth? And what would be the factors that we could point to? Yes, we know it was God's work, Holy Spirit, miraculous. This transformation came in the Western world in like 2 or 3 centuries. How did it happen, like on the ground? How would you explain it? And it has to do with part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason has to do with the plagues. So did you know that in the second and third century, there were several devastating plagues that worked their way through the Roman world, and many people died. And when plagues would come through town, again, without knowledge of how this all worked, what the risk factors were, people, seems incredibly harsh, but in a family, if somebody came down with the plague, what you would do is you would leave, and you would leave them to die. And that's what people would do. The people would get the plague, and then people would just leave them, except for these gamblers. The Christians had a different approach. They would, not all the Christians, but sometimes, frequently enough, there would be Christians who would elect to stay in the towns and care for people who were ill. And then two things happen, which we now we know from what we know about medicine. It makes sense that them staying with and then caring for people, it reduced the mortality rate because some of the people were able to be saved by getting that kind of care. So that when the plague was over, Christians had a much higher survival rate. And they would also sometimes care for other people as well, not just their own family, but other people as well. So when the plague is over and the town comes back, what do you think they're all talking about? They're all talking about these amazing Christians who visited and stayed and cared for people. And as a result, the demographic shift and then the public relation shift, over several plagues, over a period of a few hundred years, was one of the significant factors that changed the trajectory of the growth of the early Christian church, all because these people had the guts to risk it, right? So all friendships involve risk. We risk being hurt. We risk being rejected. We risk we risk doing things when we're trying to seek God. In John 15, Jesus said to the disciples that I've called you friends. Everything I learned from my Father, I've shared with you. So these were Jesus' friends, and so Jesus had this group. And what happened to this group? I mean, think about it. Jesus identified this group of friends, and he was betrayed by one of them. He was deserted by the others. He was disowned by some of his closest friends, and that was Jesus, right? So friendship is always going to involve risk. But in giving, we receive. In risking our lives for others, we find life and we find friendship. So the Bible says we shouldn't just look out for our own interests, but the interests of others. And when we do that, relationships grow, relationships build. So we're going to go to God in prayer. We're going to close now. I'll invite the worship team to come on up. And as we pray, just want to invite you to think about what friendship means for you. Are there people that you could reach out to more? Are there ways that maybe God is calling you to take risks in your service to Him?